Welcome, everybody, to Optimizing Business Planning with AI-driven scenario forecasting. Um, and we go ahead. Today I'm really excited to introduce our panel. First, we have Dr. Jahangir Amjad, head of AI platform at Ikigai Labs. He comes to us with a wealth of experience as a computer science lecturer at both Stanford and MIT. And of course, prior to that, he earned his PhD in machine learning from MIT and did significant contributions at Google, including working on the open source data commons project. We also have Vivek Sinha, who leads our enterprise product team at Ikigai. He also has a strong background in enterprise data products, so notably head of product for Adobe's pioneering B2B customer data platform, Marketo Analytics, and then also Google Ads growth platform. And then last but not least, of course, we have Ranjit Jose, who leads our applied AI and solutions team. So he's doing a lot of work with our customers, has extensive experience in GTM strategy and data-driven solutions, and is doing a lot of the things that are really empowering our organizations that we work with to harness their data. So lots of great talent here on this call. And with that, Jahangir, I'll kick it off to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be back here with you after Thanksgiving holiday in the US. The first thing I thought we'd do is this is the fourth session in this webinar series. And I wanted to sort of maybe take stock of where we are along this journey. And I will hopefully help situate some of what we're going to talk about today and hopefully answer some of your questions, trying to situate that a little better in terms of how this is part of the mix. So we started off, it feels like quite a little while ago, on the first webinar of the series where Devavra talked about, time series forecasting as a problem space in general. Talked about a lot of things starting from data, trying to get some basic analyses done, and then essentially going from there into more advanced toolings and techniques like anomaly detection, cohorts, and then going to the business end of things, generating forecasts, and sort of peeking ahead a little bit on what do we want to do with those forecasts, different kinds of optimization problems, different kinds of planning, and leading into things like what if scenario planning, which is something that we'll touch upon today. And there are other specialized things which you'll hear about in the next webinar around new product introductions and how to think about some of the things where you want to forecast things, but you have no history to go by. How should you go about thinking about some of those things? So Devavrat sort of laid the framework for that. And then we got right into the weeds of things. In the next webinar, Vinayak talked about, different regimes, different types of algorithms for forecasting, time series forecasting in particular, and sort of contrasting it with statistical models, deep learning-based solutions, transformers being the most modern iteration, contrasting some of this time series forecasting with LLMs and the LLM equivalent in the transformer world, which is what we call foundation models for time series forecasting, holding a lot of promise these days, and certainly something that you must have heard about and be thinking about as well. And then obviously touching some graphical modeling and matrix estimation based techniques that we tend to really prefer here at Ikigai because they're computationally not as intensive, don't require the world's data to be trained, and sort of are very highly performant, is what we have found in both in terms of accuracy and also in terms of the compute resources. And then last time, we sort of transitioned from there into thinking even if you have the best forecasting algorithms, you have to help them out a little bit. It's rare that the data that you have in its raw form is something you want to just directly feed into these algorithms. And so we talked about a lot of sort of quote unquote AI techniques or modern statistical and machine learning techniques to derive even more value from your data before they've even gone to the forecasting step. So thinking about how could we cluster some of those things better to allow you to learn better, trying to think about auxiliary data, which we'll talk about today as well, and external data, how to incorporate that. If your data has missing values, how do you estimate some of those things before you even get to the forecasting? And so we discussed a lot of those sorts of things, which is, gotten us to where we are today. The journey started from sort of 30,000 feet level, went deeper into what are the algorithms, which is what everybody's wondering about when you think of forecasting, and then sort of boosting forecasting accuracy with some of the things that you can do, clever things that you can do out of the box before you even get to the forecasting stage. So then we get into the world of what's next. If you have a great forecast, are you done? And hopefully the answer, I think we can intuit based on our discussions across the board with a wide variety of customers, is the answer is usually no. That's just the beginning. That's just the start. And so the first important thing is, if I told you we have the best-in-class algorithms and we have done the best-in-class clever pre-processing, and we are really confident about what we are doing in terms of generating forecasts, would you believe me? And so there are various kinds of audiences who I would need to convince before you can really, or the audience can really trust me that we know that this is the best-in-class forecast. Some of the answers are slightly easier and more numeric and metric driven. For instance, accuracy metrics. You can have W MAPES, weighted MAPES, R squared, mean squared errors, RMSE, all of those different kinds of metrics, depending on what you want to choose and what makes sense for your data. You can do this sort of accuracy on holdout sets, or you can do back testing over longer durations. You can also reserve certain parts of your data which the model has never seen or been tuned towards, and essentially see how well it's performing in terms of accuracy. But for that, you need to have the actuals. And then, of course, there's another element. Is accuracy the only thing that matters? Typically, we notice in businesses when you talk about performance, forecasting performance, people will ask questions around, if I was forecasting something that is going to happen 12 weeks from now, well, next week, that thing will be closer to those 12 weeks. It will be 11 weeks later. And then the week after, it will be even closer. And then eventually in the 11th week from now, that 12th week would just be 1 week away. If we generated a plot every single week, and we showed that there was extremely high variance of the forecast, then you would start to sort of feel uneasy. Either there is an explanation, there's so much change going on that it makes sense that the forecasts are all over the place, or perhaps the modeling and the algorithms we have thrown at this problem aren't quite doing what they are. So forecast stability is a pretty important sort of metric to consider. You can make it as metric driven as you want, but generally speaking, you would like to see some sort of a narrow distribution of forecasts, ideally, if the conditions aren't changing too much. So those can tend to be very metric driven, and you can essentially make your case around those. But when we talk about decision makers, that could be anyone from the firm producing the forecast to the data science sort of teams, to the business managers, to the C-suite, or anyone who is your target audience who eventually has to make a decision based on those forecasts. How do you convince them? Accuracy is just one part of the picture. Stability is another small part of the picture. There are other things that you'll need to do, especially talking about things that we discussed last time around cohorts. Are time series that behave similarly, think similar products in their selling profiles. Do they also tend to come out, if you cluster them together in the forecast regime, in the forecast area, do they come out to be looking similar as well? If not, then how do you explain it? Year-on-year comparisons are a very common thing with businesses, which is even if this year is very different than last year, can we put on what things were looking like? Can we compare it to what things looked like last year? Because that will really help inform what you're seeing today, perhaps, or help you really focus on why things are so different. And then decomposition, which we have discussed previously, also tends to be a favorite because you're impacted by business cycles and seasonalities and general trends and effects of recency or auto-regression, if you want to use a more technical term, the effect of covariates and other kind of auxiliary data, things like holiday effects and promotions. You want to essentially be able to isolate impacts of all of those things to be able to explain why your forecast is doing something. As an example, if you just showed a enormous spike in sales forecasted next week, or let's say towards the end of this month, but that spike is completely disconnected from everything you've seen this month or previous month, you would naturally wonder why. And perhaps it's promotions that you're expecting to run, or perhaps it's holidays that you're expecting that are going to really impact those things. unless you have that explainability, it might be harder to build that faith and trust in the forecast. And so this is a natural evolution from where we were before into now getting into building more trust and explainability. And of course, as as I'm sure a lot of you will agree, decomposition that we just talked about is really important, not just for you, not just for the one stakeholder or decision maker, but across the board. Really helps explaining away a lot of things that you're observing, which is really important as we start to sort of think about deploying and doing something useful with the forecast, really relying on them to make your business decisions. And then as we move on from there, of course, understanding the outcome, which is decomposition and accuracies and stability, things that I just talked about, trying to contrast things with history, trying to sort of answer questions around when was the last period that this particular series of interest behaved like this in its own history, or perhaps in a related product's history. And so all of those are part of the understanding the outcome. Then you actually get into a very important part of this feedback loop, which is the expert in the loop, expert feedback. There are people like yourselves who work with your data and perhaps have worked with them for years and decades, and sometimes can intuitively also understand when the forecasting perhaps isn't quite right, or maybe needs a little bit of help and nudging because you know things that you couldn't model or weren't part of the mix. In that case, perhaps you want to provide some correctional guidance and then go and regenerate the forecast. Perhaps you want to overrule the forecast in some cases and say, no, I am very confident that this is how this thing will go. And so I don't need forecasts to be, out of hundreds of forecasts, perhaps some of them you're very confident about or don't want an automated forecast. And then all of this sort of starts leading into things that you might wonder. What if I changed something? What if I changed some part of the input? Can I expect the output to change? Hopefully, the answer to that is yes. But then there are more subtle things that could change as well, which is what we're going to talk about now today, because that's really starting to get into the core of once you believe the forecasting algorithm and the setup is right, then you can start going, really driving a lot more value out of these by experimenting more, by asking more questions, changing more things, and really seeing the impact of some of those things come out. So as an example, and this, you don't need to necessarily read this slide. This is essentially just a scenario around how do you model, if you were thinking of modeling a demand accurately in a complex and uncertain environment. This is a very common generic statement across the board, which may apply to you and a lot of others that you know about. A lot of businesses obviously care about this. And here are a couple of scenarios here that we've listed out for you. These are hypothetical, of course. And then you may want to make an outcome decision. Do I do both of those things? Do I do a combination of them? Do I do one versus the other? But the really important thing to think about is that this is a very complex domain. Forecast is only one part of it. A lot of inputs that will go into making these decisions might themselves be comprised of multiple forecasts. And multiple levels of complexity. So for instance, you may be thinking, coming at it from an inventory management perspective, how will stocking similar things affect not just its sales, but does it cannibalize something else? How will it behave versus a competitor that may already be in the market with some of these things? Sales and revenue, obviously the impact. How does weather impact some of these things? Can you expect sales from a new introduction or from an existing product to continue to sort of boom or go bust or continue in the same vein? Shipping and logistics is a big part. Even if I tell you scenario A or scenario B is great, how do you make sure that your shipping and logistics is lined up to actually serve the demand that you're anticipating? Of course, store operations come into this mix as well. Can you even, if I told you, you want to stock 100 of a certain type of a shoe as my best decision, well, what if your stores can't actually house them because they have a lot of inventory already on hand, or they just don't have the capacity or the equipment or anything else that's required in this mix? And then, of course, the impact downstream and upstream on supply chains. How do they factor into all of these things? If the weather sort of takes a dramatic turn over the course of the next couple of months, you might be anticipating or maybe not. How will that sort of disrupt different things that are part of the mix? So obviously, a very complex set of domains. Not one solution is going to solve all of those problems. But what we are trying to sort of get across is that this is a complex web of things, and you might want to essentially think about how we can break different parts of this to essentially allow you to answer, bit by bit of all of these things one by one. And of course, the holy grail is that you would want to eventually arrive at your decision ideally in a probabilistic way, with some uncertainties that are part of this, taking as many of these things into account as possible. So that sounds great. One thing I'll take you back to at this point, which was from last time, was this issue of this terminology around auxiliary data. Sometimes we can call it intervention data as well. Just to sort of, because this will become important in the next slide, I wanted to sort of reintroduce this here. What are interventions? Interventions can sometimes be things that are, maybe in your control, maybe not in your control. So in your control would be perhaps how you price your own products. And so you have a history of those, and perhaps these are the levers that you can pull and plan around in the future when you're thinking of scenario planning. I could have many options of how to price different things. Marketing spends, of course, you may have a range of possibilities that you want to try for the future, but you have a bunch of history about your own decisions there in the past. Of course, inventory levels and those sorts of things are part of this as well. And then, of course, there is auxiliary data, which may be something that is not necessarily interventional. You don't get to control it, but there may be something that's coming exogenous to you, but may impact the entire thing. So if your competitor take actions, if your competitor is essentially introducing a similar product, for instance, you may already have advanced either knowledge or anticipation of it, or they may already have introduced something and you can learn from this, because sometimes that kind of data may be available publicly to you as well in studying your market and studying your surroundings. And of course, weather could be another input into these sorts of things where you may not control it, but that may determine a lot of what goes on in your business, perhaps. So this is an important sort of thing to consider. The thing to highlight here is that this is not the stuff typically that you're interested in forecasting. The forecasts are what you care about, let's say sales or demand or those sorts of things, except when it comes to these levers that you may or may not be in your control, that may directly impact some of those things and their relationships with each other. So we need to be able to model this in a way that allows you to study the impact and isolate the impact of some of these things. Just getting into essentially the more sort of specific terminology around scenario planning. Sometimes you may call it what if analysis. I think some of you answered the poll saying that you do have some basic what if scenario planning and what if analyses around what if I move things up and down by a little bit, perhaps static amounts, perhaps things that you're aware of that you've already tried in the past, and perhaps you want to be able to use some of those things in the future. And so what if analysis or scenario planning interchangeably used, one versus the other. And of course, inherently why these are important is because in all kinds of forecasting tasks or otherwise business planning tasks, there is usually a trade-off to consider. There is no such thing as making infinite money for you from your sales. Perhaps the costs are an important dimension to determining how much revenue or how much profit you're going to generate as well. Supply demand obviously is a balance. Cash in versus cash out is important as well. Should you invest now or should you hold off and do it later? There are obvious trade-offs and obvious costs associated with each of them. And then should you decide to run a promotion now or not? If you do, by how much? All of those sorts of things are important sort of trade-offs to consider. And then, of course, and we won't dive too deep into it, but I do want to mention here, and I'm sure a lot of you already have been thinking about this, is when we talk about interventions, especially the interventions say that you care, you ideally want to isolate the causal impact of those interventions. And so what do I mean by causal is not just a correlational thing that you observe, but also something that you can isolate as the lever that you pull which directly causes an outcome. You want to be able to at least model things or allow yourself to model things so that you can study the causal impact, because otherwise there may be a lot of interference. Otherwise there may be a lot of confounders where perhaps the thing that you thought is causing is only merely correlated, and there's something else that's actually causing either both behaviors or one of those behaviors. In an ideal world, of course, we would love to run randomized control trials, but that's typically not possible because they are either very costly or they may not be a possibility. If you're doing some sort of trial where you want to study the adverse impact of some decisions that you make and you already know it will have an adverse impact, you probably don't want to try it out. But in some cases, perhaps the cost is low and you can try those things as well. A lot of what we are going to discuss are things where RCTs are actually nearly impossible to run. And so what you have at your disposal is longitudinal studies or things from your past or historical data that you can then try to piece together based on historical experience, how perhaps you can reason about causal effects, even of things that you may not have tried in the past. And that is starting to get into what's the sort of more modern sort of at least thinking around some of these things. If you could only forecast or plan around scenarios about things that you have seen in the past, either through your experience or somebody else's experience, then that's great, but that might be more limited. What's more interesting is how the complex web of interactions between the things you care about, between the things that may or may not be in your control, how might they individually interact with things? How might the pricing of one thing help you not just increase the sales of that thing, which is perhaps a great outcome, but lower the sales of something else and cannibalize those things? And net, perhaps that's not a good outcome. So you want to essentially be able to study them in a combined sort of a way, for lack of a better analogy, because we sort of believe in constructing a lot of these things at Ikigai in terms of the language of graphs. For instance, graphs tend to be a natural way to model some of these things because there are relationships all across that you want to study the impact of. And of course, the need is that you want to, the past is the past. You can use that for back testing and all those things. The need is, how do you actually estimate the effect of these interventions into the future? And then in order to get there, you hopefully want to know that the system that you're built on, which will be relying on a lot of simulations and forecasts, is something you can rely and trust, so that you're never going back and questioning it all the time, questioning the basis of what these scenarios are based on. So I'll stop right here. This was a whirlwind sort of high-level tour of things, and I wanted to sort of invite my colleague Ranjit here to give us a little bit of an insight into what some of these things may look like in practice, based on some of his and some of our collective sort of experience and what we are hearing from our customers and clients. So I'll stop right here and have Ranjit take over, and then I'll mute myself as well.
Great. Thank you, Jahangir. Uh, yeah, no, that was a great overview in terms of a lot of the theoretical concepts that we need to be thinking about as we think about forecasting and really thinking through the different what-if scenarios. And my goal is to make sure that all of you who are attending get a little bit more of the aspects of how you could be doing this. And obviously, I'm going to be quickly showing this from the perspective of the Ikigai platform. But I want to start out by grounding everyone by, talking about the fact that everything we do from a forecast analysis, what if scenarios, in the end has to drive business value. And so from that perspective, from an Ikigai perspective, we're always trying to make sure that everything is, made available through a set of insights, through a set of KPIs, which are easily understandable by the folks who really care about it. So in this case, it could be executive leadership, realizing that, hey, there was a plan that was set up for FY25, but the forecasting team's already starting to say that the plan essentially could be missed, and we might want to start making considerations around interventions to apply. And so from that perspective, we always want to make sure that all of these are easily understandable, easily available to the right folks. And the key KPIs that you would want to keep track of on a regular basis are easily available, all driven by sophisticated forecasting and what-if analysis from the Ikigai platform. These are a set of KPIs here in the demo app, but these are all configurable from your own perspective in terms of what's important for your organization. Another thing I want to call out is everything that I'm going to show you quickly over the next 10 minutes, while can be consumed through the Ikigai UI, all of this is powered by API. So from that perspective, can also be fed into your own systems that your leadership, your key folks might be using. And so these are not insights and data points that you need to necessarily view from the Ikigai perspective itself. But keeping on with being able to easily understand, the idea is that you want to be able to do a forecast and then look at what's really driving all of these, and then be able to understand what might be key growth rates associated with all this, but then really be able to look, what does that forecast look like against plan? Every organization is always planning ahead, and when they're planning ahead, there are lots of decisions and choices being made. But then as data is coming in with regards to what what does sales look like this week, last month, last quarter? All of that essentially can be, essentially used from a forecasting perspective for you to like start taking a look at what does the future look like. And so being able to have all these data points easily available makes it easy for you to be able to look at what does the future look like, and are there changes that we need to be making at the right point in time. Now, continuing on, what's really important, about all these forecasts is, while the platform, can produce a forecast, what you want to be able to do also is understand and trust the forecast. And so, from that perspective, one of the key things that Ikigai always does is essentially, anytime, we're essentially training models. There's training data which is based on historical actuals. There's part of that data that's set aside from a validation perspective, and a few different ways for you to be able to now look at that and really gain the trust in the forecast. So here, what you're seeing is essentially all the data that's in red is essentially real data, but it's also training data. And then based on that, we have, the forecast, that's been essentially generated for the future period, in this case, 2 years. Now, what we can also do is overlay that with, real data, but essentially from a validation perspective. And so here, the yellow data or the yellow, sort of bar chart that you see there is essentially real data, but essentially used from validating the forecast perspective. And then as we look into the future, what we can also do is spot check that with, what's happened in the last year, and overlay that with, what's essentially forecasted, to be able to really get to a good understanding of, are the forecasts that are coming out of, the Ikigai platform, something that I trust and something I feel good about. So lots of different ways for us to be able to ensure that you're understanding the forecast, you're able to overlay that with not only real data from the current period, but also be able to pull past periods and then overlay that to get a sense of, is this, forecast going the right direction or not. Now, when we forecast, there's also a lot of sophisticated capabilities that's going on underneath the hood. And one of it is essentially, as you can imagine, in any organization, you have a deep hierarchy of what that data looks like. Let's think about a consumer electronics company with their sales. So you start with the top line revenue of the company, but then you might have different divisions that are in charge of particular products. You go down, you have product families, and then you have the SKUs themselves. And if you really explode that out, you essentially have lots of different time series, starting with a SKU, but all the way up top. And so being able to make sure that you forecast at every level, so that every sort of group associate, let's say the executive leadership and the CEO cares mostly about the top line, but particular product family managers might care about their particular product family. And so you do want forecast at all levels, but then you want to make sure that they all reconcile up. And so that's one of the key capabilities that Ikigai provides, where you're reconciling all your different forecasts at all the different levels. And one of the things that we can see here is that when you actually look at let's say the top line forecast by itself, it looks like this. But when you actually add the reconciliation, now you can see how a lot more of that realistic data is incorporated. And then when you overlay that with the real data, you can basically take a look at how that really matches up with the forecast. And so being able to use some of these sophisticated techniques in terms of feeding into the forecast, but then ensuring that you have easy tools to be able to essentially check that and make sure that you're validating that against real data is something that's really helpful. And if we go deeper down, from an explainability perspective, there are lots of things, as Jahangir mentioned, that are essentially driving the end result or the end data. Now, in this case, what we're seeing is the fact that it is the holiday period, and there is a particular holiday promotion that's essentially being driven. And so from that perspective, what we can see is that there is a big component, essentially contributing to the total sales that's really driven by the holiday period. And we can actually see the seasonality aspect of it is actually depressing the total sales. But when we put all of it together, that's essentially how we're getting what that total sales looks like, and how we can break that down in terms of the different components, and then start to get a better understanding of which part of the decomposed aspect is feeding the most into the forecast at a particular point of time, and then be able to look at that from a historical perspective, and then essentially get to a better understanding of what's really driving this. And so at a high level, what we've done so far is being able to really look at some of the key insights, being able to look at, some of the KPIs that are driven, and then really go through understanding the forecast through a few different techniques. And then now at this point, when we have a reasonable confidence of what our forecast looks like, this is the point where we want to now do a little bit more advanced capabilities like what if analysis. And so from that perspective, as Jahangir was talking about, there are aspects that you control, the intervention. So marketing spend is a great example. That's something that you can always adjust as a company policy. But there are also auxiliary aspects or auxiliary data that you don't control. So great example, CPI index. We see a lot of our customers now asking about the potential impact of tariff. And those are things that you don't control, but these are different things that you want to be able to use from a what if perspective. And so when you really look at, the ability to run what if scenarios on a few of these. So in this case, what we're going to try and do is increase the marketing spend by 10%. So if I remind you, what we started with is the company realizing that it was going to miss plan. And so here, one of the things that we're going to try and see is if we can increase the marketing spend, what does that look like? And then being able to really run that forecast, look at, okay, what do the new numbers look like? And then being able to now compare the base scenario versus the what if scenario. So in this case, what we have is the base scenario without the extra 10% marketing spend, and the what if scenario now with the extra 10% marketing spend, but also the ability for you now to look at the individual sort of SKU level at a region level. So as I said, Ikigai will help you forecast all the way down to SKU, region, store, etc., in terms of whatever granularity you need. And now having that data available, not only for you to be able to do a sanity check, but obviously also making that data available to all the different stakeholders, whether it's a product manager, whether it's a department head, or the executive leadership, obviously makes it extremely valuable. And then finally, being able to go a little bit more deeper where you might have multiple scenarios where you're trying a few different things. And essentially now with all of these different scenarios, you want to be able to compare that. In this case, what we've done is added a couple of different scenarios with plus 10% marketing spend, plus 25% marketing spend. And now you want to be able to actually look at these and see when you select those, what does that look like? And so being able to see all of this in one single screen, be able to use some of the techniques that we looked at below where you can overlay sales data and then be able to also look at the decomposed data, essentially makes it extremely valuable where you can not only look at the top level comparisons, but also go down to the SKU level comparisons and then be able to understand that and then be able to obviously inform the necessary groups within the company in terms of what this can look like. And so that's at a high level where I wanted to give you a quick overview of how Ikigai can help you, starting all the way to from looking at the insights, look at top KPIs, understanding the forecast, but then being able to drive all of these multiple scenarios so that you're able to essentially compare these and then inform the different groups with regards to this. So with this, I will end my piece, and I think we're already starting to get some really good questions. But before that, I believe we have a poll which my colleague Alex is going to queue up.
As we're moving into questions, teeing up Jahangir, I believe you wanted to kind of give a special intro to our
Right.
guest Vivek.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm back. I just wanted to thank Vivek for joining this. Vivek is heading the platform team at Ikigai. He joined us from Google and has spent a lot of his time thinking around the kind of questions that we were discussing today. It's a very, very deep, long-winded topic, obviously, as all of you are aware, because it really there are ways to get this done in a very rudimentary way, and then it is much harder to sort of think about it in terms of how to do it in a more holistic way, really trying to answer and solve the business challenges. So we're very lucky to have him because I would love to make sure that all of you get to also hear what he's observing from his perspective around scenario planning, forecasting, and these things in the business environment, given a broad range of industries that he talks to and listens to. in what's needed and how to sort of think about this in a more principled manner. So thank you, Vivek, for joining. And Alex, I think we have a couple of questions, at least on the Q&A coming in. So you have a better handle of that. So I'll let you sort of ask the question.
Perfect. And we do actually. So, of course, people are immediately wanting to understand how are we doing this in real life? What are we applying this to? I had a specific question come through around pricing. So, could be B2B price elasticity, but more broadly, I know we are doing some things with pricing as well. So maybe you can kind of speak to what we've seen around that. And then, further, what are some of the other common challenges, use cases that we're running into?
Yeah, no, thank you, Janagir, for the extremely kind introduction. I think that's an interesting question. I think you mentioned pricing. One of the questions was around pricing and pricing as an intervention. It's definitely one of the major use cases that we actually solve for our customers even today. And I mean, the short of it is, it's an intervention. We model it like an intervention, and we are able to predict demand. We are able to predict various the impact of that demand on your various other KPIs based on changes. And going slightly deeper into it, pricing can be tackled in multiple ways. One is, obviously you can evaluate pricing at different price points. You can also be thinking of pricing in terms of discounting. So you have a price, and then you are actually now thinking of, okay, if I give a 10% discount, 20% discount, what does that do to my overall different set of KPIs? So for example, what does it do to my inventory cost? What does it do to my overall ROI? I may be selling more, but inventory costs and the revenue are actually, so there are a bunch of trade-offs. It's one of the most common use cases that we see, and I'd be, very interested to learn more if you want to reach out later on what your specific use case is. Amongst other use cases, Alex, that you brought up, I think being able to, for example, manage your inventory, right? Inventory management is a very, is again another use case that we very often see, and both in terms of there are different constraints that our customers typically work with. One is sometimes they want to be able to manage. The goal is to basically maximize sales, and so you want to be able to, obviously infinite inventory can lead to inventories infinite. You'll always meet your sales, but you don't want infinite inventory. Your sales, you want to predict what your top line or what your in your confidence interval, what's the maximum amount of sales that you're expecting, and you want to be able to meet that demand. In some cases, especially in the world of B2B specifically, in some industries such as manufacturing, etc., you may end up with, long lead time. So you want to ensure that you're ordering optimum amount of inventory. And whatever is left over, there may be instances where you need to now take into expenses. And so there are financial considerations, there are demand planning considerations, supply chain considerations, and we typically also, a lot of our customers are, using our platform to be able to do scenario planning around what do those scenarios look like.
Thank you. Kind of a second sort of related question. How are the customers we're working with currently handling trade-offs between some of the different business constraints?
That's an interesting question again. I think, if I, in talking to customers over the past, year and a half, I think customers fall across a varying level of, I would say, technological maturity when it comes to supply chain planning. And so at whatever level of maturity they are, almost always there is an objective, right? So that objective could be, maximizing your service levels, you being able to fill orders, or being able to, for example, increasing revenue, or, just inventory cost optimization, things of that nature. And then in most cases, there is some amount of scenario planning being done, right? So you want to be able to then see what are these different scenarios. And then from that point, I think it starts to, there is a little bit of divergence in terms of based on the maturity of the organization. In many cases, there is rule-based decision making that's happening. And so you have simple meters like there is a rule-based metric such as, what's my low threshold of inventory, what's my upper threshold of inventory that I want to maintain, or what's my low threshold of discounting versus what's my upper threshold of pricing that I want to go over, right? So I think those thresholds are set, and that's what I would call maybe rule-based decision making. There's almost always cross-functional collaboration also. And so and this is where, again, sometimes not having a common platform can can become an issue, where you are actually talking to different teams. So for example, if you're managing stores, you want to be able to call the stores and says, I'm not, what do you expect in this year? This is what my forecast is showing, things like that. And then I think what we see definitely in terms of shift, and then what we are really excited about here at Ikigai, what personally also excites me, is that there is a very clear shift happening where people understand what the issues with the current traditional approaches are, just in terms of tool flexibility, in terms of time to actually be able to run multiple scenarios, being able to get all teams to have a clear, similar view, or not just even a similar, clear, single view of the data, so that they can actually be able to participate more collaboratively, to kind of decide things. I think the next thing really is that there's a clear shift to AI that's happening, and being able to use AI-enabled tools to actually be able to do some of that, prioritization, being able to actually, handle those trade-offs better.
I'm excited to see that this last question actually sparked some follow-on questions. So great. We've got a few coming in, but I'll say on the follow-up on the trade-up question, how does Ikigai manage situations with multiple objectives? And if whoever asked this question has any other specifics they want to add to help us more specifically answer, great. But I'll kind of start with that. When we have multiple objectives, you're trying to solve for multiple things. How do we deal with that?
I can, I can take that.
Go ahead.
So this is in many ways, this is obviously more challenging, because obviously the trade-off is usually of the form of you can't win on both on both metrics, right? Usually there is a little bit of, if you win here, you might be losing there. And so without getting into too many details, one of the things that we support in the platform, think of it as a related thing to what if scenario planning, is sort of what we call AI plan, which is essentially supply chain management or things like that, where you can simulate based on your forecasts and then essentially try to then say what should be the next steps that you should take. Think in the supply chain context. That's very helpful. Now, typically, how do you optimize around that? There's usually, we will run through many different simulated scenarios and essentially sketch out for you what we call a Pareto curve, a Pareto operation curve, where we'll essentially show you, if you turn the knob all the way here versus all the way there, how is the profile of expected outcomes going to change across the board? Usually there is a metric of interest, and then there are those trade-off axes that you may be interested in. And then so typically our answer to that solution approach is usually we'll simulate a lot. We'll simulate lots of scenarios. We'll tell you how your metric of interest sort of changes across those axes of the competing objectives that you care about. And so then you can essentially, the goal being that you can hopefully identify the optimal operating point that you are interested in, which sort of balances the trade-offs between the multiple objectives that you care about. Now, there are obviously other ways. If your question is sort of leading into meaning, you have multiple objectives that you're trying to optimize at the same time. How do you do that? We do support that. That's slightly less common. But generally, I think that maybe leads into sort of a related sort of thing, which will need a separate webinar, is when people often talk about what if scenarios, they'll talk about sort of often it's a misnomer for optimization. How do I make the optimal decisions? We don't typically use that in our what if scenario planning sort of toolkit. But at Ikigai, we certainly support optimization as well, because eventually you want to know under uncertainty, uncertainty typically generated by your forecast, for example, what is the optimal set of actions to take? Even in the pricing, we have a very large customer who works in the sort of, think of it as the insurance domain across this country, and would love to know how should I lower or increase every single person's premiums who's up for a renewal in every single state, and do it in a way that it observes a lot of sort of constraints that are put on these problems. And so what should the pricing look like when there is lots of constraints? And so that's an optimization problem, spanning across multiple data sets and all kinds of real world constraints. We certainly support that too. I wouldn't necessarily say that's a what if scenario, because that usually is you kind of model it and then you are able to come up with the optimal decision. But that's one of the things that we are also interested in integrating into the future, how optimization could also be part of the sort of what if scenario. Eventually recommend to me maybe perhaps what I should do. So that's a slightly long answer, and hopefully that addressed the question. But if Vivek have something to say, otherwise we can definitely move on to.
Yeah, I'll just add that, and I don't know if there is, I think that the one thing that I will add is that I think these questions this was a very good question in the sense that there's a real world, this is how real world businesses operate. They're seldom just optimizing for one single piece of thing. I think what's important is I think you can go solve for this. I think businesses, there is another consideration that businesses have is they need to take these decisions in real time, right? You can do you don't have, months and weeks to sometimes respond. And this is where I think Ikigai really excels, is where, you can do these, much faster within minutes to hours, these kinds of analysis. And then actually, more importantly, have real-time feedback loops. So, you have the ability to actually ingest expert inputs. You have the ability to constantly refine your forecast based on real world data, et cetera. So that's the only thing that I wanted to add on top of the technical answer that you already provided, Jahangir.
I will say, speaking of data, that's actually, especially since everybody said that that was their biggest challenge. And I think what we do at Ikigai is pretty cool around being able to bring in, different types of data, different locations, all of that. Maybe we can kind of speak a little bit to how we're helping solve that data problem. You're coming to us, you're trying to get this going, and your data's a mess, and figuring out how to start. What are some of the things that we do that are pretty unique there?
Yeah, I think when it comes to data, I think that the challenges that we see are, there are two kinds of challenge, but I'll basically bucket it into two parts. Number one is actually getting all the data sets into one place. And, whatever you're forecasting, whatever your tool set that you're using, it needs to be able to ingest data from multiple sources and in multiple forms, right? Some data will be weekly, some data will be monthly, some will be at varying levels of hierarchy, et cetera, from your different systems. And I'm sure the audience here who work both in technical and non-technical capacity will appreciate that. And then you actually take that and then on an ongoing basis, be able to now model that data so that AI can provide the most optimal output. And so, for example, you may have extremely sparse data that you want to work with, and you want to be able to model it in a way that it kind of allows you to forecast something that you mean with a much greater accuracy, and data modeling starts to become super important. And I think Jahangir can speak more to it. We have, if there is interest, actually, we can speak more to it. But we have a set of connectors. We have over 240 connectors that's pre-built. Super easy to basically just provide your credentials. We have BYOC capabilities, so bring your own, run Ikigai within your own cloud environment, within your own virtual private cloud if you want to. A lot of large enterprises need to be able to do that because they can't ship data out to other clouds. And then as it relates to just modeling data, the platform itself is baked with a whole bunch of data transformation, sort of what we call facets. where somebody, even somebody with a very little understanding of data modeling and a data science background can easily be able to use it in a drag and drop interface to actually very quickly be able to model data and visualize it and be able to then utilize and improve their forecasts. Anything to add, Jahangir? If not, then maybe we can move on.
Thank you for that.
I know we're coming up on the last 5 minutes, but I had a couple of good questions that have come in that Jahangir, I know you've spoken to in some of the previous webinars, so I'll just let you do kind of a recap. We got asking about how Ikigai compares to some of the other solutions, like Time GPT and others that are out there. And then also a question about how we're utilizing ML to include the external factors, so weather, promotions, things like that. Maybe you can kind of tackle them both, and then we'll wrap up.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for asking these couple of questions. First, I will definitely say we have hopefully more detailed answers to these from the previous webinars, and hopefully you'll be able to find some of the links to those as well. But just to recap, yes, we certainly benchmark our algorithms against a lot of existing open source algorithms. Foundation models are one of them. I believe we've benchmarked against Google's foundation model, and there's a report that we can share in our chat or as a follow-up as well. It's on our website where we have that and Deep AR and a few other sort of commonly used sort of algorithms, and trying to sort of show you different sort of performance metrics around those. And then, of course, the short answer is we compare very favorably. It's impossible, and you shouldn't believe me if I tell you that every single forecasting problem in the world, we will guarantee that our accuracy is going to be better than anything else anyone can come up with. That's not usually possible. But what we want to see evidence of is that a large number of cases such that you are able to either beat existing benchmarks, or you're able to be very, very competitive with them. And generally speaking, that's the answer that we have for across the board. But of course, the kind of domain that you are interested in, the answer may vary one way or another. The thing I would like to make sure I plug also is that the Ikigai platform is not just running our own proprietary algorithms. Sometimes the data is best suited for existing, let's say, as an example, an ARIMA model, which is very well studied in open source implementations, and our own implementations are based off of public algorithm descriptions. If that works best for your data, we want to be able to use that and support that as well. So we are not necessarily only tied to our own proprietary algorithms, which we know work really well across the board, but that whenever that is not the case, we are also not going to instead restrict you to just use them. So that's one answer around comparisons. And then the second one was around essentially how are we using external data like historical sales or besides historical sales, because I would imagine historical sales are going to be part of your primary series. But you may have other series of interest. So that's multi-dimensional forecasting. But also, how do you include weather and promotions and price increases and changes and whatnot? We have what we call the ability to provide auxiliary data, which is also think of it as time series. We've discussed this previously and hinted upon it today as well. We have the ability to provide that and tag it separately than the series that you're actually interested in forecasting, so that we can then both do forecasting by taking those into account in a slightly special way. Special because these series are typically things that you're not interested in forecasting in the future. And in many cases, some good estimate of those or actual values like holidays are already known into the future. And so we want to study the impact and essentially then isolate the impact and generate forecasts based on those. So this is something that we actually handle very natively in the platform. And I believe we'll be sharing different links with you. You can definitely give it a spin. We have a lot of training material too on our website through our academy, where you can practice some of those and see how that works out even for your use cases or for the kinds of data that we have made available in those practice sessions.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you both of you, Vivek, Jahangir, Ranji as well for coming out today. Just want to recap, there's some key takeaways here. When you get the deck, you can take a look through it. And then also a reminder, this is one of a series. As we mentioned, all of these are available on demand. Our last webinar around forecasting new product launches is December 11th. That's another good one with some kind of cutting edge functionality. So hope you all join and tell your friends. And then finally, as we mentioned, there's going to be these resources are going to be made available to you. So one around operationalizing AI, one on some of our really, I think, cool and unique technology, how we're kind of using applications of time to vec. And then the white paper that Jahangir mentioned with some of the benchmarks. All will be sent to you after that. So also, if you stay on, there will be a survey. Please take it if you have a second. And outside of that, thanks for joining us and appreciate everyone coming out today.
Thank you.
Thank you.